Hello and welcome to Archaeology 101. In today's topic, I'll be looking at everything to do with Bronze Age burial mounds, their prehistory, their architecture, and their function. You may be asking yourself, why are Bronze Age barrows significant? And the reason for that is that they mark a new cultural phenomenon that sweeps Britain around 2500 BC, which is the beginning of the Bronze Age period. Here, people from the continent were able to cross the British Channel and arrive in Britain, where they brought both themselves and their ideas. Bronze Age barrows begin to pop up all over the country, and it's a radical shift in how people lived and how they were treated in death. Although Bronze Age barrows are primarily to us a funerary monument, they actually have a multifaceted history, and the barrow probably only marks one of the events that occurred where they were situated, and there was so much more going on. Bronze Age barrows still attracted attention long after the Bronze Age period had ended, and the Anglo-Saxons and Romans must have known what these monuments were for, because they incorporated their own burials within the mound of the monument. Being a conspicuous feature in the landscape, barrows unfortunately also attracted grave robbers looking for gold, and even when robbers were unsuccessful, they would still destroy the barrow trying to look for the precious metal. Recorded excavation of round barrows weren't really known until the late 18th century, but people like William Stukeley and John Aubrey in the early and late 17th centuries did make observations about round barrows, which sort of set a precedent for research into round barrows. In the early 19th century, gentlemen antiquarians began to really delve into these features, especially within the Wiltshire landscape, where they are very prominent. Sir Richard Colt Hoare, for example, excavated a whopping 300 barrows throughout his career. And although his methods would probably make us cringe these days, it did help to set ideas about what the people of the Bronze Age period were like. Fewer barrows are excavated in the modern day, mostly because the known ones are protected, but occasionally an archaeological excavation will turn up a round barrow or two, and we're still learning more and more every time that we find a new one. Prior to the Bronze Age, during the Neolithic period of Britain, round barrows were a known but uncommon feature within the landscape. And then around 2400 BC, at the beginning of the early Bronze Age period, an influx of people started to cross the Channel, and these are broadly known as the Beaker people, owing to the beaker-style pottery that is often found within their round barrow burials. You might think of the Amesbury Archer, as he is one of the most famous burials, and he is also quite a classic burial as well, having all of the typical burial ornaments that you might find in one of these burials. He's got several beaker pots, archery equipment, copper knives, and gold ornamentation. And then he also had a barrow thrown over the top of him in his burial pit. Typical barrows consist of a mound, occasionally with a ditch, although not always, and then a single primary burial within the center of it. However, you could also then get a later secondary burial within the mound, and occasionally some satellite burials around the barrow itself. And that's sort of your typical bowl barrow, but there are all types of different barrow designs, which I'll go into in the next slide. Bowl barrows are the most typical form of barrow within Britain. However, they do have an advantage which may skew the numbers within their favour. These are large features, being about 4 meters high sometimes and around 30 meters wide. Therefore, they are much less susceptible to natural erosion and the damage done by ploughing, whereas a smaller barrow, such as a bell or a disc barrow, are much lower in profile and therefore less resistant to both ploughing and erosion, meaning that the numbers are skewed in favour of bowl barrows. Most of these types of barrows are fairly similar in design, being a round mound, occasionally surrounded by a ditch, sometimes surrounded by a ditch and bank. Sometimes they may even be separated from the ditch and the bank by a flattened surface known as a berm. However, there is one exception to this rule, and that's the pond barrow, and this is a very unusual feature, and it may not actually be a barrow at all. In fact, in the strict sense, it's not a barrow because it doesn't have a mound. It's a depression in the ground which is caused by the creation of the ditch and bank that surrounds it. Occasionally these have skeletal remains in them, but also they don't always have to, which means that they likely have a different ceremonial function to other actual barrow features in the landscape. Overall, though, the barrows are fairly typical, with a primary burial within the center. Occasionally there will be a stone or a wooden kist, which is just like a box effectively, or just a pit, and then the mound is thrown over the top. And then secondary burials can be placed within the top of this mound or even in the ditch surrounding it, and these are known as satellite burials. Barrows have complex histories, and they are entwined with the land that they're based upon. Often is the case that there is pre-barrow activity, meaning that prior to the construction of the barrow, that land was used for something else. Sometimes this can mean just an agricultural field, but sometimes the barrow can succeed a previous monument, such as a small henge. But for whatever reason, that henge is then succeeded by a burial place. These start off out as a grave cut, which is dug out by hand tools such as antler picks, and these can remain as simple grave cuts, but other things like grave kists, which are just like stone or wooden boxes, can also be used. Usually only a single individual is placed within these graves, but double and multiple burials are not unknown within the Bronze Age period as well. A mound can then sometimes be thrown over the top, and this can be stone depending on where you are in Britain, but more often is the case that turf is used as the mound material. The story doesn't end there though. These are not single events in many cases, and people keep coming back over hundreds of years throughout the Bronze Age to add burials of their own, often in the form of cremations. So it's very interesting to see how these monuments are reused over time and are not single events. What you would find if you were to excavate a Bronze Age barrow would differ depending on the period of the Bronze Age you're talking about. A typical early Bronze Age barrow burial usually consists of an individual skeleton accompanied by a beaker pot, maybe several. Richer burials also included things like copper daggers, golden jewellery, and barbed and tanged arrowheads. And these are fairly typical things to find during the early Bronze Age. However, switching over to the Middle Bronze Age period, you'd think there'd been some sort of economic collapse. This has been noted by researchers like Ben Roberts, who wrote about the lack of artifacts, particularly golden artifacts, within Middle Bronze Age burials. However, he also noted that there is actually quite a lot of wealth floating around the living at the time. They had access to gold and often wore it, but the dead don't seem to have these artifacts. In fact, they're very poor all around. They're often cremations, in fact, rather than whole burials, and they're usually put inside an urn, and they're often part of a cremation cemetery or barrow cremation cemetery. They also do freaky things like invert the urn as well, so they put the urn upside down, and researchers have put all sorts of fancy metaphors as to why they do this, but no one truly knows why they do this at all. In conclusion of barrows then, we've looked at the varying designs which can differ from the bowl barrow to the pond barrow, We've also seen how the burial treatment differs from the early Bronze Age to the Middle Bronze Age. But I think the main takeaway is just how complicated Barrows are and what a varied and rich history that they actually have. Even today we're adding to a Barrows story by interacting with them, maybe that be through excavation or simply by visiting them. This is all part of the Barrows story. And I would like you to think about that the next time you're lucky enough to go visit a round Barrow, and think of all the different things that have gone on there and how you are now part of that Barrows story. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching this video and for supporting my channel. If you're interested in looking at the research that I used to make this presentation, you can find links to the figures and sources in the description below.